Welcome to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. You can send questions for each show on Twitter using the hashtag IndieBeacon. Now sit back and enjoy learning about our guest for this show.
Hi, this is Rox Burkey, and I'm delighted to be able to have with me tonight a really honored guest, Mark Gottlieb, an agent from Trident Media Group. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much for having me on the show and for that kind introduction.
Well, you know, it's really an honor to have someone that is at your level to help share some information with other authors and even the readers that are listening here. One of the things that's very important is, I think, your view on how authors need to hold themselves in high esteem. And how did you get that viewpoint?
So I think it's important for authors to not just think highly of themselves, but to present themselves in a certain light. And part of what's involved in that is how authors compare themselves to maybe other best-selling authors. You know, sometimes when an author says, my work is this, meets that, they should think of books that did really well in the marketplace, and it helps place that in the minds of agents, editors, publishers trying to figure out where a book would go on their list.
So when authors communicate with you and correspond with you, you know, the 5 to 3 year range of competitive seems to be what would resonate the best with you. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, authors who are making comparisons to their books, different books in the marketplace that were published within the last 3 to 5 years, because book publishing, you know, was different before then, and books were written slightly differently before then. So it makes it a more accurate comparison.
So that's an interesting statement. So the books were written different before them, or the view from the public and the readership is very different from before then?
I think it's probably a combination of the two. You have what the readership seeks out, and you have what, you know, so what might be in vogue, and then you have the ways in which publishers are publishing books. So, for instance, you know, urban fantasy has kind of cooled off as a genre for a while. That audience has matured a lot. It could very well come back. I think we see genres come back all the time. There, for instance, rom-com has been coming back. There's been talk of horror books coming back. So not just how books are being published, but what's also being read.
When you look at an author that you want to take on and help support from an agent perspective, what are some of the strong items that you really look toward that make a difference and kind of help bring them to a higher level?
Well, in considering an author for representation, I'm looking at a number of different factors. So how well written is the query letter? That's the first indication to me that the writer can write. What's the hook of the story? What's the meat and potatoes of it? You know, I would say the comps, like we talked about, the comparisons, the bestsellers. So how could this book fare in the marketplace? Where would it fit in? And then, you know, apart from looking at the story itself and the quality of the writing, I look at the author's credentials. Like, do they have a lot of relevant writing experience? Have they gone to prestigious workshops and conferences? And have they published in literary magazines and journals, things like that?
So I know that you seem to have a real positive view for indie authors, but that doesn't mean an indie author can represent themselves less than any other author that's in the marketplace today. So the comp letter is very important. Are reviews also important from your perspective when you're considering an author and their works?
Well, if it's an indie author coming out of, you know, the indie book space, I would look at number of reviews, bestsellers, rankings. I'd need to know what the sales numbers are, because inevitably I get asked that question by book publishers. A book publisher will say to me, you know, has this book sold 50,000 copies and hopefully, you know, at a decent price, which is a very high threshold, you know, and so sometimes authors whose books I find online I'm interested in working with, I see that, and I would love to work with authors. I see them online, but I have to ask that question inevitably because I'm going to get asked that question by the publisher.
And that's a fair statement. So I know that Trident Media Group does represent two publishing houses, indie authors. What about for other medias, like, you know, those that want to pursue film and all of, you know, the film industry right now with books is like tremendous, at least by all reports.
Right, we do represent authors in other spaces. We do a lot of work in the area of audiobooks, foreign rights for books in translation, even book to film and TV adaptations. But to work with an author coming out of like the self-published space or the indie space who merely wants an agent just to represent them for audio or foreign rights or film and TV rights is sometimes difficult, you know, because for a number of factors. We're able to do that in certain instances, but on the whole, it's much easier to get those kinds of deals done with audio publishers, foreign publishers, and film and TV companies when there's a traditional book publisher in the picture, because it lends some provenance and just helps convince those companies to want to publish those books a lot more. And it makes it, being in business with such authors, much, much easier.
So then I guess that begs the question, is there still a stigma attached to an indie author in general? I mean, as an indie author, there are easier ways to get your stories out there, get your books out there. Social media certainly helps, but are there still barriers that indie authors need to overcome?
I think very early on, there was a lot of snobbery, unwarranted snobbery in our industry toward, you know, people coming out of the self-publishing space, and there was just no reason for it. And I think a lot of that has changed over time because a lot of best-selling authors have been kind of engineered out of that space. They've carved a niche for themselves, but I think what's started to happen now more so is that because there was a big boom early on in the ebook space, where some authors hit the jackpot, a lot of other authors jumped on board, and it's become a very crowded space. I think, you know, you could agree that there's now kind of just a glut of material in the ebook space, and it makes it very difficult for authors to stand out. You know, not just by their nature of their writing. You know, someone could be a fantastic writer, but if they're not a marketing guru, you know, in the ebook space, it's just so hard for them to get the right kind of attention. And then the other thing, which has also occurred, is that the pricing of ebooks are so competitive that it's kind of become like a race to the bottom in terms of, you know, 99-cent ebooks, you know, whereas used to see more ebooks priced a lot higher or at decent prices. It's harder to convince publishers to take a book on when it had been selling for 99 cents, even though it had sold tens of thousands of copies. What that does for the publisher is they realize that they're going to have to convince this author's audience or similar audience to be willing to pay for more for a traditional book where the profit margins are wider. So it's created a lot of stuff like that. Some good and some bad, like with everything.
Well, and that's true. I mean, that's really a valid point, is the market has changed. There's more entrance into the market. And like every business, when you have a glut, it becomes more difficult to rise to the top. So how do you get excited about an up-and-coming author? Do they contact you, or is it something you see in social media, or do you just read their story?
So if I'm finding an author in the self-published space, I tend to focus first my efforts within the top 100 because they need to climb into that space. They need to have been selling enough copies to eventually convince a publisher. It's just an unavoidable milestone. That and with that hurdle aside, yes, I'm glad to dig into the book. I can sample a lot of this online. I can read the descriptions of the books or buy the ebooks online, which is great because you get it in an instant. And then if all goes well, I'm happy to have a conversation with the author about the prospect of literary representation.
So one of the interesting things that you mentioned was top 100. When you say top 100, is that on Amazon? Is that on USA Today? Where is that top 100 reference that authors need to maybe focus their marketing on and really help drive to gain your attention, or someone like you? I mean, you're the best, got that, but I mean, where should they go?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. And yeah, I mean, I think authors want to look at probably, yes, places like the USA list, the Amazon Top 100. The USA list is great because it's a very accurate list in that it looks at volume of sales. Whereas, believe it or not, the New York Times list, even though in a lot of people's minds it's become like a prestigious, very, very prestigious list, it's a proud medal a lot of authors want to wear, they actually look at velocity of sales, and they're far less accurate. They do, it's believed that they do their reporting based on kind of measurement of thumb, like they'll call the 10 biggest booksellers, ask them what their, top 10 or whatever best-selling books of the week were, and they kind of average it out from there. That's what a lot of people believe. The USA list is purely focused on volume, and the Amazon list is also more focused on volume. And the thing about the Amazon list is that it comprises, I would say, the vast majority of ebook sales. That's easily 80 to 90% of ebook sales in any given period. I mean, there are other big retailers in the ebook space, and obviously there's Barnes & Noble, but you can get a pretty good sense of things both, yes, from the Amazon Top 100 and the USA list.
Okay. So Barnes & Noble's has kind of come under scrutiny from the media perspective in that they seem to be not as powerful as they once were, and Amazon is quote unquote crushing them. So when we come back from a short little review from our sponsors, I want to kind of talk about how the industry has changed, if you don't mind, Mark. Can you stick around?
Sure. Sounds good.
Perfect. Thank you.
What started as a love letter to her son has become an international love letter for all parents to their children. Now you can read acclaimed author Shanalee Charbonneau's story to your children. When her son was very sick, she calmed him by singing her own song to him. She turned that song into the book, My Mama Loves Me, I'm Her Little Boy. She wrote 3 more magical books for all parents and kids 6 and under. Available at Indie Lecter, Amazon, and all local and national outlets.
Hello, I am the author and poet Denise Bryson. I am the author of The Things That Cross My Mind, Love's Reality, both in book and audio form. I am also noted as one of the best poets of 2011. I have 2 new projects coming up. One is the Blinky series, where Blinky tells us all about our coins and our bills for our children. I also have a book coming out called Say Ye. It's quotes from Denise Bryson. just inspirational and that will help you along the way.
Thank you for watching or listening to this show. Indie Lecter is proud to sponsor this programming. As a thank you for listening or watching, we would like to give you a 10% coupon code that you can use on our bookstore at indielecter.store. Use coupon code video19. Again, that's indielecter.store, coupon code video19 for a 10% discount on any purchase. Thank you.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow.
Thank you for staying with us. This is Rox Burkey, and I really am delighted to continue the conversation with Mark Gottlieb. He is a representative and principal in the Trident Media Group from an agent perspective and representing authors of all styles. So thank you for staying with us, Mark.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. I'm a literary agent at Trident Media Group in New York City.
And so when we left, I wanted to kind of talk about your viewpoint of where you see Barnes & Noble's going, because it really has been very controversial in the media these days about Amazon, like steamrolling would be a good term.
Sure. And just to clarify, I think you mentioned I was a principal at the company. Yes, I work at the company as a literary agent, actually. So just to be perfectly clear. But yes, to speak to Barnes & Noble, I think the perception in the industry for a long time was that it was as though Barnes & Noble was on life support. And, you know, a lot of people in book publishing were very troubled by it because they were the main retailer after places like Borders had closed and there were fewer places to be selling books. And Amazon had entered the marketplace in a big way, not just in taking up space with ebooks, but people going online and buying physical books. So that perception is slowly beginning to change, though, in that the company that owns the Waterstones book franchise in the UK is now in the process of taking over Barnes & Noble. They've purchased Barnes & Noble, so they'll have a new cash infusion, and hopefully, you know, the retailer will be much healthier as a result.
So keeping that competitive edge between not getting, you know, one monopoly in this particular space, I think is really important. It helps all kinds of authors. It helps readers. So I think that's a good viewpoint. Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate that. So, you know, when you start looking at books, do you have a favorite genre that you prefer?
In looking at books, I work with a bunch of different genres. I wouldn't say I have any one favorite kind of genre, but I work in a number of different spaces. On the fiction side, I do a lot of commercial fiction and upmarket fiction. Basically, commercial fiction means like a big best-selling book, or, you know, like a thriller kind of book. And upmarket fiction is another industry jargon term. It's basically this crossroads of where literary fiction meets commercial fiction. And so it might have elements of both. And I obviously do some stuff in the children's book space, some graphic novels. I've done the occasional young adult or middle grade book. And I've even done a lot of books in the nonfiction space, whether it be celebrity memoir or, you know, a gift or humor book occasionally.
So it wants me to ask, so how did you get started reading? I mean, what was your family life like? Were you reading at the age of like 4 or 5 in children's books and just really loved reading and authors and variety?
Well, yeah, I grew up in a very literary family, given that it happens to be my family business where I work. My dad, he owns and operates the company, and I work with him. And so, of course, I was always around books from a very early age, and it's some of my earliest memories, you know, whether it was reading The Little Engine That Could, or Dr. Seuss, or any number of those things. And those memories really, really stay with you.
So from your childhood, do you have a favorite group of books that you like? Dr. Seuss you mentioned, but I mean, there are so many wonderful children's authors. Do you have kind of some favorites that you really like?
Definitely The Little Engine That Could. You know, he kept chugging along, believing in himself and all that. And there was another book I liked, which actually I think has gone out of print. It was called The Little Lump of Clay by Diana Engel. You could probably find copies on Amazon. It'd be great if some publisher came along and brought that book back into print. But it was about an adorable little lump of clay at the bottom of a box of clay in a classroom. No one played with this little piece of clay until one day a boy picked him up and made him into a little teacup, and he felt like something. And then he felt important for the first time in his life, and this teacup is left on a windowsill. And the window's left open, and the teacup's afraid it's going to dry up. You know, it didn't make it into the kiln or any of that. Didn't get painted and glazed like the other pieces. And it's the weekend, and all the students have gone home. So it rains. It starts to rain. Just one drop hits the little lump of clay, and then another drop, and there's hope. And the clay is made moist again. And then on Monday, the students come back, and he's made into a piece of pottery. Finally, he's saved. And it's nice. It was a nice little children's story to grow up with.
A nice good news kind of story, right? Isn't that what we always did when we were kids? Everything had a happy ending.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So now when you take a look at authors approaching you, any kind of author, it could be an indie, it could be anyone approaching you. What do you feel are the biggest criteria for you to measure them and want to work with them?
Well, we spoke about this just a little bit earlier in the show,
Right.
but the biggest items are, you know, because they're coming out of the ebook space, it's different than an author who is completely a debut. Like, if an author has never been published before and I were to show their manuscript to a publisher, the publisher can only make a purely subjective decision. They have nothing to go on other than the writing, and in the eyes of the publisher, they're thinking, we have a 50-50 chance with this writer. You know, there's no prior book publishing baggage. But for an author coming out of the ebook space, they will have had books that have self-published. And so it's very important that those books were successful, because the publisher won't make a subjective decision. They're going to make more so a business decision in looking at the sales numbers. So that's first and foremost. And then after that, the writing obviously is very important, you know, in either scenario. But an author who is coming out of the ebook space and didn't maybe necessarily experience the kind of sales numbers they wanted, they really have to think in terms of the spirit of reinvention and how they will maybe use a pen name or remove editions from online, or maybe they will improve their sales track record. But that is one of the inherent risks of kind of going into that space and then trying to engineer oneself into traditional publishing.
So when one goes into traditional publishing today, do they need to have a social media presence and those kind of elements to help get them rated better in this space?
Sure. I think a lot of that will inevitably help an author because, you know, it shows the publisher that there's an outlet where authors can be marketing and promoting their books to a fan base. I think it is a lot more important, though, to an author of nonfiction who needs to demonstrate to a book publisher that they have a really big platform in place in terms of big social media numbers or newsletter subscribers or things like that.
So I think that's very important to understand. So nonfiction does really differ from fiction. Also your credentials from a nonfiction perspective as to how your word is perceived. So,
yeah, the factors for nonfiction are different because nonfiction is idea driven.
Right.
whereas fiction is more so about the quality of the writing and the author becoming a household name by extension of that. So for an author of nonfiction, the idea needs to be interesting because people are coming to nonfiction maybe for a certain kind of prescription they need, right? A certain kind of how-to or something like that. They're interested in a subject. So yes, like you said, you need to be an authority on your subject matter. Like maybe you're a history professor and you want to write a history book. That's an obvious one. But what you also need to demonstrate in the nonfiction space, which is different than the fiction space, is your audience needs to already be built in. The publisher wants an author in the nonfiction space who has maybe 1 million social media followers, because the publisher is figuring if just 10% of those people buy the book, then they're still in excellent shape. It's easier said than done, but there are books written on the subject about how one can go about constructing a platform, and it sometimes happens in a very organic way.
And that's a really great point. And Mark, we're going to take another short break to hear from our sponsors. When we come back, I'd like your viewpoint on audibles, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Stick around.
What would you do if you had to put your life on hold to care for a loved one? I'm Charlotte Kenyon, award-winning author of the book, You Have to Laugh to Keep from Crying, How to Parent Your Parents. That was a question I had to ask myself some 16 years ago, and you'll have to ask the same question. I had a father-in-law with dementia, a mother with Alzheimer's, and a dad with Parkinson, all at the same time.
What would you do if you found out everyone on the town council were thieves and murderers? That's what happened in Bandera, Texas in 1873. John Cruder was the marshal, yet he needed to operate outside the law in order to balance the scales of justice. He is the Midnight Marauder. You can find his books on Amazon.com and TopWesterns.com in paperback, digital, and audio. I'm Roy Clinton, and I hope you'll read The Midnight Marauder.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
Hey, I'm Rox Burkey, and thank you for joining us for this last segment in our discussion with Mark Gottlieb. He is with Trident Media Group. Mark, thank you for staying with us. When we left, I wanted to talk about Audible, and I want to have it from your perspective. How do you feel that this medium change has affected book publishing and or author adoption?
Sure. Audible kind of came about as I would say, a surprise to book publishing. They, for a long time, occupied a quieter space in the audiobook space. To us literary agents, they weren't usually the first choice of sale, because you had Amazon, which owned these two sister companies of Audible, which produced the digital audio, and Brilliance, which did physical audio and then would have its sister company Audible produce the digital audio MP3s. And what came about is very surprising in that Audible was excellent at marketing itself. There were ads you would see regularly in the New Yorker, subway ads, bus ads, billboard ads, TV ads, and people caught on a lot more to digital audio than they had in the past. And then you had technological advancements which contributed to the rise of digital audio, in that now you buy a laptop and chances are it doesn't have a CD player. Or you buy a car and it's unlikely to have something like that, because people are really carrying around iPhones, things that play MP3 files, and they're very much so on the go, which is what digital audio kind of lends itself very nicely to. So the tables kind of turned on Brilliance, in that Audible is now the primary audio publisher in that market space. And at the same time, the listenership in audio just grew exponentially on the whole. People started turning more to audiobooks, not just because maybe they're at the gym or they're driving somewhere, but I think our attention spans have been shortened quite a bit by technology and the other things that can take up our day. And audiobook is something that kind of follows you around.
What about the discussion that when you were young, your parents read to you? Now you're older and you have this wonderful storyteller or narrator or voice actor telling you a story. Is that helping people kind of like just have more fun?
I never really thought about it from that viewpoint, but you actually make a really good point there that it could take people to that place where, storytelling in its oldest tradition is an oral story format. People, before they could write, there was language, and stories were told, I guess, in primordial times, by cavemen and cavewomen over fires and at night, because stories were a way to pass things down from generation to generation. Like, how did we know to be afraid of a saber-toothed tiger unless we were really told a story about it? And so stories really began as a means of survival and communication, I think, between the generations, and began in that oral tradition. And then when people began to write and cave paint, they started to read and look at stories in different ways, whether it was, in hieroglyphics or anything like that. So, but you're right. There's something very deeply inside of us all, not just in hearing our parents read to us, when we're listening to an audiobook, but I think there's something in our DNA, almost like in our animal nature, when we hear a story read to us.
So Mark, I think that's really fun, and I think it's another aspect we all have to consider, especially when a lot of authors are actually narrating their own stories. So we're getting really close to the end now. If people want to look at some of your blogs, where can they best get you?
So I'm actually on the Trident Media Group website. If you go to tridentmediagroup.com I think it's /agents, or you can just go to tridentmediagroup.com, and there's a page there where there's a list of literary agents, and my page is there. And then, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I have an Instagram, and I also have a blog at literaryagentmarkgottlieb.com, which updates on occasion. But I would say the best place is tridentmediagroup.com.
So, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I thank you for your insight, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you again. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. To learn more about Indie Beacon services, to be a guest on the show, or to advertise on our show, please visit our website at indiebeacon.com.